This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Tim Lane. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode, I have a great conversation with Tim Lane. The first issue of the second volume of his series Happy Hour in America comes out tomorrow from Fantagraphics, and we have a great conversation not only about that new series, but also many of Tim's other comics and a variety of other matters as well. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are more impressive than that. And if you check out DCBService.com right now and do a search on Tim Lane, you'll find that they have two of his previous books, Abandoned Cars and The Lonesome Go, at 35% off of the cover price. That's a great discount and a way to introduce yourself to the wonderful comics of Tim Lane. That's DCBService.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. I had a really nice conversation with Tim Lane, and in fact, the conversation goes on for a little over 2 hours. What turned into a conversation primarily about his new comic, Happy Hour in America, Volume 2, turned into a discussion of comics in general, even the teaching of comics. And so it was a conversation in the fullest sense of the word, and I had a wonderful time. Now, this isn't the first time that I've talked with Tim for the Comics Alternative. 2 years ago, or almost 2 years ago, I published an interview with him on the Comics Alternative blog. This was something that he and I did via email. It was a back and forth that lasted not quite a year, and it's quite a substantive interview in and of itself. So if you're listening to this and want to check out that earlier interview that I did with Tim, go to the Comics Alternative website, comicsalternative.com, and do a search on Tim Lane, and you'll find that interview that was actually published in January of 2016. In some ways, this conversation that I have now with Tim is a follow-up to that earlier interview, but it expands in a variety of different ways on some of the topics that we discussed, bringing into the mix not only his previous works that have been collected in Abandoned Cars and The Lonesome Go, but also his plans for the Steve McQueen biography and this new series, the second volume of Happy Hour in America. I really had a great time talking with Tim, and I want to share that with you now. I'm happy to have on the Comics Alternative Tim Lane. The first issue of the second volume of Happy Hour in America comes out tomorrow from Fantagraphics. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Derek.
You know, I guess I should say welcome back to the podcast because not quite 2 years ago, we published on the Comics Alternative blog an interview that you and I did together a rather long and substantive interview.
Yes.
And this came out, I guess, the very beginning of 2016, and we had corresponded back and forth for almost a year via email about, at the time, your most recent work, The Lonesome Goat, but we also talked about Abandoned Cars and some of the other works that you published in anthologies.
Yeah, it was. I was very appreciative of how substantive the interview was, the questions you asked, and just the organic nature of the interviewing process was very illuminating, actually, for me.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed that interview, and I encourage our listeners, if they haven't seen this, to go to the Comics Alternative website, comicsalternative.com, and then just do a search for Tim Lane, and you will immediately find that interview. And it is a rather long and thorough interview. And I hope I don't repeat myself this time around, it being on audio, asking you some of the same questions. But I guess where I want to get started here, not only in referencing our earlier interview, but to ask you, it's been about 2 years since we last communicated in this way.
Right.
What's been going on with your work since the publication of that blog interview?
Well, I have been very hard at work on what I'm calling an interpretive biographical graphic novel on the actor Steve McQueen. And the reason why I say interpretive is because it's not a straight biography. Kind of hard to explain what I mean by that. I am approaching it as if, in a sense, let me backstep a bit. The Steve McQueen and the kind of persona of Steve McQueen were very much a part of my upbringing. Mm-hmm. There was a kind of sense of, he was a character who kind of permeated the culture, both in a very tangible way, with my uncles and my father and the people of that generation, as well as a more distant way. And by that I mean, he kind of permeated the culture in general. There was a kind of attitude about what a masculinity was, what a kind of outlaw type character was, or an outsider type character was. It's suffice to say that he represented a lot of different things. And so when I was born in 1970, he only had 10 years left in his life. So a lot of the Steve McQueen experience happened before I was even born. But, but like people like Elvis Presley or James Dean or, characters like that, he had already influenced the culture. So I was born into a kind of culture that was already influenced by him, or you could say, I guess part of the questions I'm playing with or trying to answer for myself with this book are, how much was he influenced by the culture in which he was raised? It's, a combination of both. But so I'm looking at it from his life from a multitude of angles. I'm not just telling a straight kind of story about Steve McQueen from birth to death. I'm trying to interpret it through my own filter.
That's interesting because in one of the longest pieces in this issue, Happy Hour in America, Steve McQueen has vanished. After I read that, and I have to admit, as much as I enjoy Steve McQueen's work, I'm not a Steve McQueen aficionado, and I don't know a lot about his life. And so after I read the story, Steve McQueen has vanished, I thought, did he vanish? Was this a news story? And, I went to Wikipedia and read the very, very truncated, brief biography of Steve McQueen. And even though there was nothing about him vanishing where, newscasters like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather are wondering, where is he? Right. There was this period where he left film, I guess in the mid-'70s after The Towering Inferno, to do his kind of his own thing, to just travel a bit, to kind of find himself, if you want to put it that way. And so what you're doing is you're creating, if we could call it this, I guess, a fiction within certain biographical, historical strictures.
Boy, I have to remember that. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Yeah, that's exactly it. That first story, obviously, it's, there's he did leave the Hollywood scene. So we could get into a discussion about how history is interpreted. That's, in itself kind of an interesting subject, and it's something that comes up a lot while I'm working on this particular book. But he did leave Hollywood, partly because he had kind of attained everything that he had wanted and discovered that there was an emptiness to it, that there wasn't much to it. He'd kind of gotten there and found, sort of asked the question, is that all there is? But I take that a little more literally in the story, where, you've got Walter Cronkite, on the news talking about it as if it's this major event, something that's, that the rest of the world needs to be concerned about. That never happened. Nor did he ever, shoot bullets at a TV that is floating in a river. But
as far as we know,
right. But no, I essentially what I'm doing is I'm trying to identify on some level with him at various points in his life and try to imagine it through my own eyes. Mm-hmm. Like, how would I feel? And it's difficult to do that with someone like Steve McQueen because, I'll never be as famous as Steve McQueen. I'll never be as cool as Steve McQueen. I'll never be, there's a lot of things I'll never be. But I can relate on my own level to some of the things he experienced. So, the book is going to be all over the place in terms of like I actually have written stories where they are original stories wherein I cast him as the lead character. So it's kind of like telling a story about Steve McQueen, and he is the actor. It's not a biographical story. It's just a tale in which I think he would have been a perfect actor for. Mm-hmm. One thing about McQueen is that I don't think he was ever really given the chance to show just what a great actor he could actually be. But it's difficult to explain it or try to describe it because so much of what I'm trying to do with the book, I get it in my head. I mean, I understand it in my head, but trying to explain it, it seems like the best way to explain it is to just do the story, But I'm trying a lot of different things. I'm also working with a lot of different cartoon mediums, genres, particularly like I'm dealing with his upbringing when he was just a baby. Just a kid, and I'm doing that in kind of the style of, Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy. But what really works, I think, with that is that when you read Nancy, you're very much seeing it from the point of view of a child. Mm-hmm. It's just, and this is something that's just kind of intuitive. I'm no, great intellectual behind all this stuff. It's not like I'm, totally intellectualizing all of this stuff. But I do know when I read Nancy, I feel like, Sluggo. I feel like Nancy. I feel like those little kids. Mm-hmm. And so there's something about that way of cartooning that it just seems really natural. It seems like a really natural move to try to tell his story through that, kind of the style, the aesthetic that Ernie Bushmiller used. And also, although McQueen was young when he was in the 1930s, it's close enough to the era in which Nancy was in the newspapers to make it also have a historical relevance as well.
Right. One of the things you were saying about telling the story of Steve McQueen and trying to align that with how history is written, brings up the subject of perspective, right?
Yeah.
It depends on who is telling the story and where they are at a particular time that they are narrating in one form or another the historical event. And I'm curious, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you were mentioning some association between Steve McQueen and where you're coming from. It seems to me that in this story, in this next issue of Happy Hour in America, Steve McQueen has vanished, that a young Tim Lane is the one who is narrating this, because the narrator makes his, and I'm assuming his, presence known almost definitely on the very first page, because the narrator refers to himself, I being the writer of this yarn, hear the buzzing hum of the crickets, so on and so forth. And the narrator refers to himself several other times early in the story, and also gives us information about the narrator's age, which would be the same as yours.
Yes.
And so would this be a way that you inserted yourself into this story as narrator?
And that's going to be the first story in the book. And that's, I think, and it's kind of interesting how the process of working on this kind of thing happens, because I've got a list of story ideas, and I'm just kind of doing them as I go along. I'm not following a chronology. With Abandoned Cars and with The Lonesome Go, for better or for worse, I don't have a preconceived idea of how these things are going to fall together. I just start working on them. And so, when I started working on Steve McQueen Has Vanished, I didn't know where it would fit into the chronology of the book. But after I finished it, I realized this should be the first story, because I'm right away associating myself with the character. At the time the story takes place, Steve McQueen is 45 years old, which was how old I was when I started writing the story and finished the story. The writing of the story, I was actually 46 by the time I finally got the last page done. But that just tells you how long this stuff takes. But I wanted that first story to be very, very much an invitation to the reader into this idea that this is one person who grew up with this kind of idea of Steve McQueen, or to call it, Steve McQueen is just a good example. There's a lot of personalities and there's a lot of baggage, I think, that comes along with 20th century, particularly when I was growing up in the later 20th century, baggage about what it meant to be a man, what American masculinity was all about. Mm-hmm. And through my life experience, I've kind of come to a place where I'm questioning all of that stuff. And now I'm a father. And so I have a 9-month-old son, and I'm trying to parse out what of this myth about being a man in America means. What do I want to pass on? What do I want to completely get rid of? How much of it is enslavement and how much of it is actually positive, if that makes any sense to you? Mm-hmm. And so, starting with McQueen in 1975, I feel the aching bones. I feel the age. I feel the sort of just disappointment of things that you spent years to attain, and then you get them, and they are just they're paper mache, they're paper moons, or however you want to describe it. And so, in that first story, I'm very much trying to relate to McQueen. I'm very much trying to relate to him as a 45-year-old man who is just kind of like reflecting on his life. Now, he doesn't know that he only has 5 years left, and for all I know, that's all I have too. But you get to that point in life, and you're like, well, how much more time is there? You've got time to reflect, as much time to think about the future, and so yeah, I'm very much trying to identify with McQueen. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, it does. Another thing that your comment about the perspective of history and how history is told, it reminds me of some other work that you've done. Now, this is collected in Abandoned Cars, and this is your story of Stagger Lee. Yeah. And I think it was originally serialized in the Riverfront Times, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, in St. Louis.
Yeah.
But you include the completed story of Stagger Lee in, I think, toward the end or at the very end of Abandoned Cars. And there you do point out that, especially in terms of music, the tale of Stagger Lee shifts and morphs depending on who tells it, what version, what perspective.
Absolutely.
And you even challenge, if I remember correctly, you even in Abandoned Comics challenge other comic creators to tell the story of Stagger Lee in ways that may change the story slightly each time, in ways that the different versions of the song has.
Yes, absolutely.
So perspective and changing of the facts.
Yes, absolutely. One project for the future, something that I've already started working on, is sort of a story, a graphic novel about Stagger Lee that would follow the persona, the kind of legend and the cultural impact of Stagger Lee. Because I know that song, and I've the older I get, the more I relate. I can relate to the character of Stagger Lee. I'm not African American. I wasn't born at the turn of the last century or just before the turn of the last century. There's a lot of differences, but there are certain elements about the Stagger Lee persona that I can totally relate to, and I feel like, although it's particular to the African American experience, there is a universality to that story that I know even I can relate to in, 2017. So there is a value, I think, in what the history books can't grasp, or what the history books can't wrap around when you're just dealing with facts. And it's a troubling time to be talking about these things, because I don't mean that to be misunderstood as fake news or inaccurate news or any of the kind of nonsense that is happening. I think as just the result of President Trump and a lot of just some of the cultural reactionary things that are happening. It's an unfortunate time, but I would love to be able to try to peruse that character as thoroughly as I'm trying to do with McQueen. And I'm just using McQueen because he, regardless of what you think of him as an actor, he did live a really pretty exceptional life, overcame extraordinary odds, and attained what a lot of us would say is the ultimate American dream, only to find that it was kind of, there was an emptiness to it, that it didn't have substance, and so he went searching elsewhere for that substance. That's one of the beautiful things I think about American mythology or certain folk heroes or anything like that, is that there is so much subtle, nuanced substance to them, but trying to get to the heart of it is, for somebody more intelligent than me, somebody who has a PhD in American culture studies or something like that, maybe they could do it. Mm-hmm. I think of like Stephen Ambrose, who can make history just a wonderful read, just by stating the facts. but I always have felt that there's more to what's happening out there than just names and dates.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Now, I should mention that we've been talking about Stagger Lee, and even though the vast majority of the innards of this upcoming issue of Happy Hour in America, it deals with Steve McQueen in one form or another, the wraparound cover is
that's actually
Stagger
I forgot
Lee.
about that.
And I have to tell you, in looking at that wraparound cover, I couldn't help but think of Thomas Hart Benton's murals that deal with the American landscape in one form or another.
That's exactly where I'm going with it.
Really?
Yeah.
Mission accomplished then.
Yes. No. Very, very. That's incredible. Yeah, it's very astute. I have become really fascinated by mural artists, particularly people like Diego Rivera and Thomas Hart Benton. And I mean, it is pictorial storytelling, and there is a quality to that type of storytelling without words, where you're kind of like following a progression, and it's just it's telling stories through pictures, but just in a different way. And so, that piece is actually part of this project that I have in mind to do regarding Stagger Lee.
Now, okay, this issue that's going to be coming out tomorrow, Happy Hour in America, #1, Volume 2. Right. So this is not a brand new comic, although for many of our listeners who may know your work, like The Lonesome Go or Abandoned Cars, your collections, they may not have had access to your first volume of Happy Hour in America, and that came out, what was it, between 2011 and 2016, over six issues, right?
The first issue came out in 2003.
Oh, really? That long ago?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so talk about somebody who has no idea what they're doing. What I did was, so this gets into just kind of a fairly long story about just a 3-year-old kid's dream to just have a comic book produced on a regular basis. That's initially what I wanted, was just to continue like produce Happy Hour in America, almost exactly like Daniel Clowes did with 8-Ball, where he would work on, I loved, one of my favorite books by him is Like a Velvet Glove Cast in Iron. And he was producing that through 8-Ball. But there was also other material in there that wasn't 8-Ball related. And I loved that. I loved the fact that you could go and you could get, the latest 8-Ball. I can't remember how much it cost at the time, but it was affordable. I remember that. And you just, you'd get just this extraordinary comic experience. I'm also thinking of, like Optic Nerve by Adrian Tomine. These great comics that were coming out at a certain time, in the 90s, I believe. Yeah, just in the 90s. And so that's pretty much what I wanted. And so I started producing Happy Hour in America in 2003, just self-publishing it. And I think so the issue that will be coming out through Fantagraphics will actually be, I believe, issue number 8. But they're doing this great thing where, and I didn't know this, but in the history of comic books, when a new publisher takes on a title, they'll roll it back. So it becomes issue number 1 and then volume whatever. And so you kind of start over, but you still have those, like, for the person who's really interested, they could go back and find the older issues that in my case were self-published, but back in the day, who knows who would have been publishing them.
Right. So the various issues in this first volume of Happy Hour in America were self-published, And one of the few places you could actually get them, at least that I found, was through John Porcellino's Spit and a Half.
John Porcellino.
Right,
that's right.
yeah.
That's
and,
right.
And so that's where I've gotten, I think, a number of issues of Happy Hour in America in the past. But now you're with Fantagraphics, and so the distribution is going to be quite a bit different now. Now let me ask you, what was it like, or what gave you the idea to continue Happy Hour in America and then take it over to Fantagraphics? And then along with that, what was it like when you approached Gary Groth and others and said, hey, I want to do not a book, but a new comic book or a continuation of my comic book series?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's kind of funny because so I'm under contract to finish the McQueen book. And so Gary is already, he's been waiting for that. And it's taken me, I'm already 4 years into it, and I'd say I'm half done. And so I'm just trying to give some sort of background to the absurdity of me coming to Gary and Eric and asking if they'd be willing to publish Happy Hour in America, which incidentally they turned down several times before they picked me up with Abandoned Cars. So like I'd been sending them issues of Happy Hour, and they weren't interested in the early issues of Happy Hour, but when I sent a concept idea for Abandoned Cars, they were more interested in that. So I've got two things kind of working against me. One, there were a few years there, probably like 6 years, maybe 4, where they are already saying no to the comic book Happy Hour in America. 2, I'm already, they're expecting me to finish the Steve McQueen book. So, but I'm a big fan of the comic book, just the old-fashioned traditional comic book, for philosophical reasons as well as very practical reasons. I'm a big fan, and so, I describe it as like being that guy at the end of the basketball court who just before the buzzer goes to end the game, throws the basketball as hard as he can, just, sweaty, totally out of energy, and just tosses it and hopes for the best. And just by chance, the buzzer rings as the ball's in midair, and it just by chance goes through the hoop. Why Gary and Eric decided to say, sure, let's try Happy Hour in America. I think I have 6 issues. They're willing to go 6 issues with me.
Okay.
But I just threw it out there. And they were willing to do it. So I don't know.
Wow. Well, in this basketball game that is, I guess, comics and the history of comics,
right.
You're right that when it comes to non-mainstream comics, mainstream, that's a different game, so to speak. But I think with the kind of comics that you produce, which I guess we can roughly, loosely call alternative, right?
Sure.
The individual issues of comic books are becoming a rarity. Now, you mentioned 8-Ball. Well, we don't have 8-Ball anymore, which is unfortunate. Like you, I absolutely loved the individual issues of 8-Ball.
What did you? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what did you? So, like, here's the difference. With the thing that I liked about 8-Ball is that you would get more than just like a velvet glove.
Right.
You'd get other things that Klaus was working on. Mm-hmm. Now with Black Hole, and I'm a huge Charles Burns fan, but you always got chapters of Black Hole. I can understand if all you're going to produce in a comic book is chapters of a book that's ultimately going to be published, in a final form. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing other kinds of stuff, let me go back. I can understand why a publisher would be like, no, let's just wait till it's done and, just sell it as a book. But if you've got like with 8-Ball, you've got a variety of things happening. You're including chapters from the book, but you're also including stuff that may have nothing to do with the book, that may not find its way into print anywhere else. It'll just be, for the pleasure of whoever is reading it. I think of it as kind of a launching pad for experimentation. Pretty much just a launching. Comics are great as a way to keep work out there that is intended for larger ends, but also as a launching pad or a catalyst for experimental ideas, maybe one-offs, just things. Because as I find myself, I'm deeply engrossed now in the Steve McQueen book, but there are times when I've got to get away from Steve McQueen a little bit, and so. You know what I'm saying? There's material that I would like to be producing also, less extensively, but one-off kind of stuff or just experimental projects. And so I look at books like 8-Ball and I model my essential model. I wish I was a little more original than this, but I'm not. My model is pretty much 8-Ball. I just loved the way Daniel Clowes did that. But I look at other things like Black Hole, and I understand why a publisher would be less inclined to invest in that sort of thing. If it's just going to be chapters for a book that ultimately, there's nothing ephemeral or digressive in the book. It's just going to, you're just publishing chapters for that one ultimate book. Does that make sense to you?
Oh yeah, definitely. And especially in those very early issues of 8-Ball, not only did we get the various story segments of Like a Velvet Glove, Cast in Iron, but we also got short comics about Pusey. We also got Lloyd Llewellyn.
Lloyd Llewellyn?
Yeah, exactly. And so what Clowes was doing is, he was working on this one longer ongoing narrative, Velvet Glove, but then he was working on other stories or series that he eventually collected in different books. And there are other creators who in alternative comics who've done something very similar. And I'm thinking of what Seth used to do with Palookaville, in that we would get a main storyline, but then we would get some other stories here and there. Now, he's turned Palookaville into, I guess we could call it a graphic novel. It's a book. It's not an individual issue of a comic book. And he's doing some of the similar things, but it's in book form instead of in comic book form.
Right.
To a lesser degree, Chester Brown did that with Yummy Fur, though, because he had the main storyline, but then he would include other material as well. And then there's Love and Rockets. Let's not forget that.
Love and Rockets. So now there to me is a prime example of, what the Hernandez brothers have done with Love and Rockets and those characters. I just love that. It's like a Rubik's Cube. The world they've created is so epic. And, to bore into it, you really need to have some, you need to have kind of the heart and lungs of a marathon runner. It's epic. They're what they've done is so expansive. And it all started with the comic book. Mm-hmm. And I love that.
Yeah, it started with a comic book or comic magazine. It turned into eventually a comic book. Then it became a graphic novel, and now it's back to a comic magazine. And, and that's interesting in that with this latest incarnation of Love and Rockets, it going back to a quarterly magazine format, where each brother, not just the two brothers, are telling each his own story, but both Jaime and Gilbert, in every issue, they're telling different stories that they will eventually, I'm assuming, collect in different volumes. And so they're doing what Clowes did in 8-Ball in many ways.
I agree, but I think what the Hernandez brothers have done, I've never seen anything like what they've done, because everything seems to have a correlation to like some sort of, there's a universe out there in which all of these things belong, but I don't quite know how to explain it. I've just never seen anything done like what they're doing with Love and Rockets, or just the body of their work in general. I've never seen anything quite so expansive.
Right. Each brother, in his own way, both Jaime and Gilbert, are doing something akin to what, let's say, in literature we get with William Faulkner in Yoknapatawpha County.
Perfect. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. And with Gilbert, it's the what used to be called the Palomar Stories.
Right.
But now it's kind of expanded to where we're in a post-Palomar period, but there's still references to the Central American fictional town of Palomar. And with Jaime, it's the Locas storyline.
Right. I think you nailed it with the Faulkner connection. I think that's I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that's exactly what. Yeah, that is a perfect kind of parallel to make.
Yeah. And another thing that I think is interesting about not only the latest incarnation of Love and Rockets, but coming back to this next volume of Happy Hour in America, is that the Hernandez brothers, and now you're continuing to do this, kind of bucking the tendency now in terms of alternative comics, whereas you did have creators, again, like Seth and Daniel Klaus, who had comic book series, but now they've gone the way of the graphic novel or the book format, where they, for a variety of reasons, economic as well as creative, I guess, have foregone the comic book as a package, right, to deliver the stories that they want to tell. Now, Adrian Tomine has held on to the comic book format, but in essence, what Tomine has done with Optic Nerve is, with, I guess, every 3 issues, he'll collect those stories as a book. Right. So, I mean, he probably has a book in mind as he's writing those 3 stories. So he's doing something.
I'm not so sure. I think that would be I think that would be a logical thing to imagine. But I think there's something kind of when it gets down to it, I'm not sure that the person producing the work always knows exactly how things are going to fall together. If they're anything like me, anyway, I think that things tend to fall together whether you're expecting them to or not. But there is a chance, and I could be totally wrong, probably am.
Yeah.
But there is a chance that he is just producing work, and then at a certain point he's going to be like, oh, there's a thematic kind of continuance here. There's a thematic whole. Yeah. This could be a graphic novel, or whatever. I don't know. But I don't mean to be argumentative or anything. I'm just saying. It's a potential. There's a possibility that maybe things fall together a little more intuitively or organically. I know for myself, as soon as I try to intellectualize what I'm doing, analyze, let my brain take over, I'm always hurting myself by doing that, because intuition seems to be, light years ahead of analysis. Yeah. Self-analysis anyway.
Now, what you just described in terms of writing individual stories and then seeing how they gel later on, and you may or may not collect them. I mean, I can see that as kind of a system for you more than I do for Tomine, and for this reason, that after his, I guess, mini-comic phase, in other words, when he started to be published by Drawn and Quarterly, I mean, you can basically map it out. After every 3 issues, he has a book collection. And we have that with Summer Blonde, we have that with Sleepwalker, we have that with Shortcomings, and now Killing and Dying most recently. Yeah. So, I mean,
my God, what an incredible collection.
Yeah.
Killing and Dying. I mean, he is just to me, I read as a fan of the short story, and that's kind of how I see myself, as I think very much in terms of the short story. he is such a great short storyteller. As far as in comics, I don't know anybody better at the short story than him. I just always blown away by what he comes up with.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And another thing I admire about Tumaini is the fact that he continues to produce individual comic books along with the books, but the comics come first. And so he's one of the few, along with you, who have not given up the comic book delivery system.
Yeah, well, but I think I think Noah Van Sciver's still doing Blammo.
That's right. That's a good point.
It's interesting because I had a great conversation with John Porcellino about this, and I actually asked him, because I know more about the history, like dating back to the 40s and 50s. I know more about those comic books than I do contemporary comics, and so I asked him, who are some other than Noah, who is doing younger writers, who's doing some interesting comic book work. And he was like, there was a moment's pause, and he was like, well, King Cat. and I was like, wait a minute, King Cat's a zine. I thought that King Cat was always intended to be that sort of punk rock, do-it-yourself zine kind of thing. Because John Porcellino, I mean, just in terms of inspirations, he's about as high up there for me as you get. Totally different style of working, totally different style of drawing. But if I were on a desert island, I'd want to bring collections of King Cat. And, he brought up the point that, well, it's 32 pages. What defines a comic book? Really interesting question. It made me think about it, because when I had thought of comics, I thought color cover, certain, size, certain way of distributing it. But he had a really good point. And, you already mentioned that Love and Rockets started as a magazine. So what is a comic book? Interesting question.
Right. Now, when you're talking about, you can call them zines, or I was going to say self-published comics. I do think that there is a wealth of examples out there in terms of the continuation of the comic book. But when you're talking about, at least within the realm of, let's say, non-mainstream comics, those that are published and distributed by larger houses like Drawn and Quarterly, Fantagraphics, and even Kilgore Books and Comics. You talked about Blammo. Yes. Those that are more well-known, that seems to be going the way of the dodo. And so if you want non-mainstream comic books or individual issues, not books, to get your comics, then, going with the zines, going to the self-published, in other words, going to something like Small Press Expo in order to get your comic book fix. Because it's interesting, you go to the Fantagraphics table at SPX, you go to the Drawn and Quarterly tables at SPX, primarily you're going to get books, right? But almost every other table at SPX is going to have like what we call comic books, or sometimes zines, if you want to call them that. In other words, something more akin to the comic book format than the book.
Well, tell me something. One person who comes to mind for me is Ben Mara. He produced a lot of all of his work. He started as comics, didn't they?
I'm not sure. That's someone who, I admire the work that I've seen of his, but I don't know a lot about the work that he's done. And I think I'm familiar with more of his books.
Like One Man, oh gosh, I feel terrible that I'm not thinking of it right off the top of my head, but One Man World, the last graphic novel. No, actually, no, I think Night Moves is coming out recently.
Night
coming
Business?
Out soon. Night Business, yes, is coming out soon. I think that started as a zine, or started as a comic book.
And then American Blood.
Did Terror Assaulter.
Mm-hmm.
I think that started as a comic book. I think also Jim Rugg, didn't he produce a fair amount of what he's doing
with Street Angel?
With Street Angel as comics first?
Yeah, he has. Now, I don't know if there have been individual issues of Street Angel. There may have been. I'm not sure. It's interesting, though, that now what Jim is doing is he's coming out in book form with shorter stories of Street Angel that are in large format hardcover editions through Image that can get a little pricey. And I mean, so if you like Street Angel and you want to get your Street Angel fix, if you get these books, you're going to have to pay more than you would for an individual comic book. But it is a nice package.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jim Rugg is always worth buying, no matter how much it costs. But that's partly why, for me, comics. I guess I'm trying to sort of state a case for comics that there are graphic novels out there that I have a hard time justifying to my wife that I should buy, and I'm a cartoonist. It gets to the point where your average guy like myself on the street who, has a family and has to, think about groceries and bills and things like that, it's not easy to pay out a couple of $100s for a couple of graphic novels. Whereas I just remember in the 90s, you could go to the comic store and pick up some, just extraordinary stuff you couldn't find anywhere else, and voices that you couldn't find anywhere else. And there was something extremely just kind of inherently proletarian about that. Something really democratic about that. And it's that connection to the history of comics that I like so much. Comics historically have been this kind of like place where these kind of like this idea of being able to buy it for super cheap, fairly accessible to the larger, the public at large, coupled with this kind of like capitalistic make a quick buck shysterism kind of met. And I mean, so much of the story of America is right there. And so I just really, I love that history. Plus, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I know that comics as a form didn't originate in America, but the comic book didn't it?
Right, yeah. The comic book, as we know it, had its origins in
with
the
like
United States.
Funnies or
exactly. It's
new funnies or famous funnies.
Yeah, it's basically taking the individual strips from the newspapers and putting them out into format.
Collections.
Exactly. And
then finally taking strips that were turned down by the big syndicates and publishing those.
Right, and then eventually coming up with brand new material through studios, in essence, that were produced specifically. They were there specifically for the purpose of churning out comics that then publishers could buy and then package in comic book format. Right.
Yeah. And to me, all of that is, I find that so fascinating. I mean, a lot of this stuff that it was done, there would be like package deals, or it would be selling a product. You'd get this, you'd get a comic to come along or to go along with the product. And I mean, there's so much of just kind of like the American, I don't know, whatever, zeitgeist, the American attitude, however you want to put it. It's all this big jumbled mess in comics. And it's interesting because there's this new book. Maybe you've read it. It's called Of Comics and Men.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay, so it's by I'm trying to remember the author's name. I recently read it. He's this French guy, and
Jean-Paul Gabillet.
Yeah, and it's about the history of American comics, and it's really interesting. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it, and it's a great read because, and I think it's also interesting because It's written by somebody, a Frenchman, so it's not written by an American. And the French have this great way of recognizing American art before Americans do.
Mm-hmm.
I think of like film noir. I think of jazz. I think of various things.
Jerry Lewis. Let's not forget him.
Jerry Lewis, Mickey Rourke.
Yeah.
Right. But it's a great read, and it really goes through and chronicles the advent of comics in America, and that whole idea of, like, on one hand, it was really cheap. Anybody could get it. But then on the other hand, you had all these people who just wanted to make a quick buck, and everybody jumped on that train, and, wonderful stuff. To me, that, I don't know, maybe that's not wonderful to everybody, but I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think Gabulet's book of Comics and Men is great, and if our listeners aren't familiar with it, they should definitely check it out. Now, Tim,
I think it just came out, what, in 2016, 2017? It's very, very new.
Well, actually, the hardcover came out from University Press of Mississippi in, I think it was 2009. But
I might be a little behind.
But but the paperback version came out a number of years after that, and that's the way that many university presses work. And I know that with their pop culture series, because Mississippi does a lot on comics, they'll come out with a book in hard copy that is very expensive, and then after several years, they may come out with a paperback version of it. So I know that the paperback version of Comics and Men is much more recent.
Yeah, it is. The hardcover is like, it's $55. You're spending a fair amount of money, but I think it's down to like 24 or something like that now with the soft cover version.
Right.
But for anybody who's just a fan of comics, an enthusiast of comics, I think it's a must read.
I agree. Now, Tim, you've mentioned several times in relation to your own comics work, talking about defining American culture, the American spirit, and that leads me to a couple of issues and questions. One, getting back to your focus on Steve McQueen. I mean, it seems to me that Steve McQueen in many ways is kind of a quintessential American figure, not just because of the acting work that he's done, but because in many ways he's, I think, a lot like other characters, both famous and otherwise, that you reference in, across your body of work. These are people who are outsiders, who are in some ways rejected by society, people who live on the outskirts, on the edges, rebels. Whether you're talking about a figure such as, Steve McQueen or Woody Guthrie, or the, I guess, faceless hobo that you write quite a bit about in what eventually became The Lonesome Go. I mean, you're dealing with not only outsider figures, rebels, people who define things on their own, but they do so in a way that I think embodies what you're calling the American spirit, which leads me to, I guess, a question here is that I see in this first issue of the second volume of Happy Hour in America, you reference a phrase that comes up again and again in your work, and that is the great American mythological drama. Now, having read your larger body of work, I think I have a sense of what the great American mythological drama is, at least I hope, even roughly. But I want to ask you, and for our audience in particular, how would you define the great American mythological drama? What is that?
Well, that's a really good question. So just to kind of back up a little bit, I don't make claim to even really know. This is something I'm exploring, like you walk into a dark room and you try to feel your way through it. It's the culture I was steeped in. It's a very personal kind of journey because like I say, the ghost of Steve McQueen has haunted, not Steve McQueen expressly, but so many people like him. The people I know, the people I grew up with, my brother, my dad, my uncles, I see, and my friends, and especially like my brother's friends. It's interesting how, I was just talking to my wife recently about this. It's like so much of what I write about is in a sense an attempt to not only understand where I fit into this culture that I was born into and kind of steeped in, but also to understand my brother, which is interesting. It's another story, but it's easier to, it's the fins of a 1959 Cadillac Coupe de Ville. It's hobos on a freight train. It's
Stagger Lee.
It's Stagger Lee. It's less of, it's P.T. Barnum. Mm-hmm. It's all kinds of things that,
Jack Kerouac.
Oh, absolutely. Kerouac. But when you're looking at Kerouac, you're looking at, Thomas Wolfe, you're looking at Whitman, you're looking at, Sam Shepard is to me an extension of Kerouac. He's kind of like the ghost of he's like Kerouac as he, after the youthfulness wore off, and coming to terms with kind of like just that. There's to try to I'm much worse at trying to explain what it is in academic terms than I am through my stories. I think the reason why I write and the reason why I do what I do is because I'm trying to figure out what that is. I think it's interesting too, because we're kind of in a place where a lot of, it involves the idea of the American dream, as elusive and generic as that term is. There's a quality to that has been forever unattainable to me. Mm-hmm. The world that, say, my grandfather grew up in, and fairly passed down to me through himself and through my parents, all very, vitally incorporate this idea of this kind of mythology about what America is supposed to be about. But not necessarily, I suppose on a superficial level, but I'm more interested in kind of like examining it. I'm trying to figure it out myself. But some of those things that I mentioned are a part of it. It's a whole lot of things. It's this idea of what democracy is supposed to be about. It's this whole idea of what capitalism is supposed to be about. All these big words, big terms. What did the founding fathers really believe? Right. What about their contradictions? What about is there a way to rectify or to at least come to terms with the contradictions?
Yeah.
There's.
And, I was going to say, it's also something as simple as the open road, and not literally a road, but this kind of openness to possibility. So it could be the vast stretches of forest that we used to have,
Absolutely.
Or it can be something like Kerouac's On the Road. It could also be something that, where you're living, you're very familiar with, the Mississippi, right? I mean,
yep,
so this
absolutely.
brings in, one of my heroes, Mark Twain, who participates in, I think, trying to wrap our brains around what you call the great American mythological drama.
Right. And the Mississippi River is a perfect example. The landscape is a perfect example. Just the expanse of this country. They, early Americans talked about the fact that this country, the sublime. And it's interesting because, the word sublime, it talks about not only it essentially is the awesomeness of something, but also, like its beauty and its wonder and its extraordinariness, but also something scary, something that's fearful, something that's beyond wonderment. And so all of these things on some level, they all make sense to me. on in a general way, this kind of idea, there's so many of the ideas that people think of when they think of America that on some level are very, they all sound very wonderful, but then there's a very scary element to them as well. And I think in contemporary culture, especially, we've run into so many contradictions. I mean, it's no surprise to me that like anxiety or panic disorder or depression are issues that we're dealing with constantly as a culture, because I mean, you look at enough billboards or hear enough advertisements and people are, it's constantly these notions that, you can do whatever you want. You can be whoever you want to be. You should be successful. You should be this, you should be rich, all of these things. And you look at yourself and go, I'm not any of these things. What happened? I'm trying, but it's not working out somehow. And finally, that's where the ordinary person kind of finds themselves. And I think that it can be a very haunted house,
Well, the words that you're using, like haunted, remind me of, and I guess this is one of the last things or the latest things that you've done for Riverfront Times, and that is a trip down the Mississippi to explore the spooky river. Was that the last thing you did for Riverfront?
That was, and I wanted it to be a whole series. It's funny because prior to being married and prior to having a son, there were so many things that I was willing to do that I just can't do anymore. For example, the amount of money that I was able to get from the Riverfront Times for those stories was getting to be so meager that it became ridiculous for me to continue those projects because they just weren't generating enough money. But the old me would have I wouldn't have cared about that kind of stuff. I would have just pursued that whole series. I mean, there's such a rich history and such a rich story behind the Mississippi River, not just how it relates to the city of St. Louis, but how it relates to the country. Mm-hmm. And I so much wanted to continue that series, but it just got to the point where it was cost effectively. It wasn't working out. So I only was able to produce one, but concurrently I was working on also a more surreal meditation on the Mississippi River, which I was producing for the Believer magazine, but I don't know what happened. I don't know if have they gone under?
I don't know.
I don't either. Huh. But initially I was asked to produce a series of panels, and the idea was that they were going to spread them throughout the publication. And the idea was that no matter what panel you saw in the sequence, it would always tell a story. So essentially, imagine like a deck of cards, and
this is in the Believer. What you were telling?
Yeah, this was for the Believer. And if you played 52 pickup, no matter where the cards fell, it would still tell a story. So I was doing this kind of meditation on the Mississippi River based on that concept, but I don't know what happened to the Believer. They asked me to do it, and then it's never been published. So I don't know. But so all that to say that I essentially had two concurrent stories about the Mississippi going on. One more specific, which was the Riverfront Times one that was more historically, I guess, concrete. Mm-hmm. And the other was more of a surreal kind of meditation on the river and what it's meant and what it's been and what it continues to be, I guess.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I find interesting about the spooky river that appeared in the Riverfront Times is that you do something you rarely do in your comics, and that is insert yourself. Now, I say rarely because just a while ago I mentioned you, or I guess a non-embodied presence of Tim Lane, is the narrator of Steve McQueen Has Vanished in this new issue of Happy Hour in America.
Yeah.
But, you told me in that interview from 2 years ago that unlike a lot of contemporary comics creators, you kind of resist, or you actually actively resist writing yourself into your comics, and you really don't like the autobiographical mode as much. You did a little of that, I think, in Abandoned Cars, but that was just... I think rarity, right? When you were jumping trains.
It is. But I did include some autobiographical stuff in The Lonesome Go, but the thing about autobiography for me is that I kind of agree with, I believe it was Oscar Wilde who said that the easiest way to tell the truth is to wear a mask. Mm-hmm. I find for myself that's true, but there's that, and then on the other hand, there's this idea that I tend to think there's more than one self. I think that through our life we change, and there are different representations of ourselves that are highly subjective. I think that there are many selves in general. I don't think that character is based on personality. I think that personality can be many different things. I mean, think for example of like how you interact with, let's say, when you go to a job interview, as opposed to when you're hanging out with some people at a bar or whatever. Mm-hmm. There are many manifestations of self, and so I've noticed just through my own life that I rarely look, when I look in the mirror, I rarely look like the person that I feel. And so that's take that one to Freud or whomever. But so what I've tended to do, even with like the freight train hopping stories that I produced in Abandoned Cars.
Yeah, that's the Spirit, right? That story, the Spirit.
Yeah, Spirit, right. I look at the way I represented myself there, and that was as close as I ever got to like trying to just really like take pictures of myself and try to imagine myself 10 years younger and look at old photos of myself and really try to like be accurate in the depiction. But I look at that now and it's like, okay, so here's the action, the Indiana Jones / Jack Kerouac version of Tim. That's not really, that's not that, that's not all there is to me. That's who I was just then. Mm-hmm. In Abandoned Cars, there's this whole series called In Another Life, which kind of it's episodic. It goes throughout the whole book, and in that case, I just kind of threw out the whole idea of depicting myself as I would look or see myself in the mirror. Instead, chose a kind of persona that more represented how I felt at the time. And then with Spooky River, I just went straight hair like Tintin. Simplify it as much as possible. I've always loved that portion of Understanding Comics from Scott McCloud's book where he describes how the simpler you make something. Actually, he goes into quite a bit of detail about how Hergé used his characters in Tintin, where like the backgrounds are all fairly realistic, but the characters themselves are highly cartoonish.
Right. And
that the viewer then puts themselves into that. They see themselves as that person because it's so simplified. Mm-hmm. Do you know the part I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, and because his philosophy is that the simpler or the more iconic the figure, the more we're apt, or readers are apt, to see themselves.
Yes,
so it's a way of drawing the characters in. And he uses as examples characters such as Charlie Brown, Nancy, and Bart Simpson.
Right, exactly. And so that's what I was trying to do. I was looking at Tintin a lot and pretty much just aping and stealing what I could from him.
Yeah, you do mention that storyline in The Lonesome Go in Another Life, and there are some semi-autobiographical, although masked, references there to you, but also in that other storyline from The Lonesome Go, Notes of a Second-Class Citizen.
Yes, yeah. I mean, all of those people are on some level extensions of myself, depending on. I mean, with the character from Notes of a Second-Class Citizen, it's essentially just imagining, like, if I took a particular train of thought and went way off the deep end with it.
Yeah, if you become a misanthrope.
Yes, that's where I would be. That was very inspired by Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky. I've always loved. I mean, I continually return to that book. I love that book, and so it was, my kind of like ridiculous way of in a sense saying that guy could live today as much as he could have in 19th century Russia.
And and don't we see an earlier version of that figure in Abandoned Cars, the little stories that kind of punctuate in between the longer pieces?
The manic depressive from another planet.
Yes, yeah.
That guy. He's the same guy.
Yeah,
just a little more off the deep end.
Yeah, and also a little more comedic.
Yeah. Well, that's, again, I mean, that's me trying to like get under the hood of Dostoevsky and try to figure out what makes him work so well. Because, like, Dostoevsky's got this great way of taking a character and making him ridiculous and humiliate him, but then suddenly just slightly change him. It's like a prism, he just slightly changes, a different light comes through it, and suddenly he's like, well, this guy's not so ridiculous. Like he's okay, I can follow this guy. He's that makes sense. And then he'll just change it a little bit again. And it's like, oh, that's ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, there's humor, but if I'm doing my job if I'm doing it well, or if I'm able to do it well, I would be able to pull that trick off where, yes, on one hand, he's ridiculous. He's you can tell he's going off the deep end, but if you look at it, if you just change your perspective on him just slightly, he's not all that ridiculous.
Yeah, and in fact, one of my favorite strips from, I guess, the Manic Depressive from Another Planet in Abandoned Cars is when this character is walking down the street and he's lost in his thoughts and he's thinking, what I would dress like and how I could kind of confuse people wearing, a seersucker suit, a bowler hat, a cane, and wearing an ascot. And as he's walking down the street, there are a couple kids behind him that are one's hurling a can at his head, and we see it right like the moment before the can smashes into the back of his head.
Right. Well, I mean, hey, if I hadn't had those thoughts myself, I couldn't have written them. Oh. Thankfully, nobody ever threw anything at me in the back, never hit me in the back of the head. But that could just be like another version of me, being like, wake up. You know what I mean?
So any thoughts of wearing an ascot and bowler? You want to be hit in the back of the head.
If, I tell you what, if I could, I would do that. But I just, there's something about making yourself so to do that, if you really at all care, to do that would make yourself the object to be seen, and I hate that. I don't want ever to be, like the one, like I'm not a costuming type person. I just don't like it when. I prefer it when I'm the observer rather than the observed. So, but I think when I was writing that, I had just moved to St. Louis and I had no friends and I didn't know anybody, and I was literally that apartment I drew was the apartment I was living in. Now I never had, the door never talked to me.
I hope not.
No, none of that stuff ever happened. But I do distinctly remember feeling like, I think when you're by yourself for a long enough period of time, you kind of start wanting to do something just to. I can't even explain what that would be. Maybe I should get a shrink because I don't. I can't explain that, but I do remember distinctly having that feeling of just like, what if I did something completely absurd to upset these people, and to I don't know. Is it just, you know, the I coming out and saying, you must notice me? I've been alone too long. I don't know what that's all about, but that's what storytelling's for, you know. So I don't have to do that. I can have a character do it.
Right. Well, you know, another character that you spend a lot of time with, you know, first in the Riverfront Times and then collected in the Lonesome Go, is Jackie No Name.
Yeah.
And, you know, we were talking earlier about outsider figures, rebels, people who live on the periphery of society. And, I mean, Jackie No Name embodies all of that. And
right.
Now, I guess you've had to, temporarily suspend your stories of Jackie No Name because of the Steve McQueen work. Is that correct?
Well, see, that's another reason for an interest in the comic and this idea of having other things happening, because like some of the people you've mentioned, or we've talked about, the second-class citizen, the anonymous character from In Another Life, Jackie No Name, I want to continue their stories. And, you know, I actually have those stories scripted. And so I want to continue them. I just, you know, don't know. Right now it's a question of priorities. And, you know, like, well, you know, Gary is expecting me to get this book done. So I really do need to focus on that. The McQueen book, I mean.
Right.
But, you know, yeah, Jackie No Name was it's funny because I didn't get into I didn't know I was going to be in comics. Yeah, I'm not one of those people who, like, when, you know, I read comics, they were very inspirational to me when I was a kid. I remember reading, like, actually The Spirit. When I was growing up in the 80s, Kitchen Sink Press was reproducing all of the Spirit episodes, the old newspaper episodes. And I was just hooked on The Spirit. And I don't know what publisher it was, but somebody was publishing the reprints of all the EC stuff too, like Crime Suspense and Shock Suspense. I thought at first that it was Dennis Kitchen who was doing that, but I think I might be wrong. Anyway, that stuff was coming out, and I was really inspired by it. But later on, you know, I went to college, and I was like, no. You know, I had this real struggle with, like, am I going to be a fine artist? Am I going to be a writer? Which am I going to be? And finally, I came back to just, you know, like I had kind of I felt like I was taking myself way too seriously. So I was like, you know what? You always love the Spirit. Why don't you just do like a Spirit-like character? And so that's where Jackie No Name came from. This was like right after college. Like I was 23 or 24. And so I started with that character a long time ago, and that's when I first started kind of playing around with this whole idea of American mythology and stuff. To me, he was the kind of lovable loser, the hapless character. You know, if you see, you know, like watch movies like you know, Paul Newman in The Hustler, or even in Cool Hand Luke, he's, you know, there's evidence of the Jackie No Name archetype in those characters, or even in like Jack Nicholson in Five Easy Pieces. You know, these characters who you empathize with, but you just know they're going down. You know, like there's a lostness to them. They're lovable losers, you know.
Yeah.
And so and I, you know, for whatever reason, not that I'm all that lovable or a loser, but that those are characters that I always really empathized with. I felt a kind of connection to. And so I always loved the 1940s, this period right after World War II, like 46, 47, 48, when America was in this period of, you know, kind of like questioning itself, and that's when all kinds of weird things like film noir and things that were kind of, they didn't necessarily scream let's celebrate, we just won the war, like there was this seamy, dark undercurrent going on in America. And I was really interested in that. But to make a very long story short, I wonder, though, sometimes if maybe that whole belligerent piano Jackie No Name thing might just have, maybe that's one I should have just let go. Maybe, like one of those ideas when you're younger, and you should just let it go.
Well, I hope in future issues of Happy Hour in America, you are able to intersperse, along with the Steve McQueen installments, a continuation of these various storylines, in another time, belligerent piano. I'd like to see those stories continue to play themselves out in your comics, as we were talking about, Klaus used to do, or the Hernandez brothers currently do, in their respective comic books.
Yeah, especially with the Hernandez brothers, I just thinking in terms of their collected work and how epic it is, and even when it seems disparate, it's connected. You understand what I mean by that? Mm-hmm. I feel like that would be the ultimate, to be that good. To be that good at I also think of Kim Deitch. He has this interior dialogue going on with himself. At least that's the sense I get from his work, that there's this interior dialogue going on with himself, or a monologue, I guess. And he's got to get it out. I think a lot of us feel that way, but not all of us are as successful at doing it as, the Hernandez brothers or Kim Deitch or, some others.
Yeah. And
it really feels like a demon, There are some people who it really feels like they got to exercise this thing. Other people, it seems like it's more just, technical acrobatics or, various things, and I could be very unfair in even saying that. All I'll say is that, like, people like Kim Deitch, like the Hernandez brothers, like even John Porcellino, I feel like they just got to push this stuff out. It's just like there's something festering that needs to get out, and I can relate to that. Whether I'm as successful at it as they are, I can't say, but that would be the ultimate.
Yeah. No, I think your use of the word demon in association with Kim Deitch and his output is really appropriate, because I was thinking immediately of Waldo. And, Waldo is, in some of the comics, described as a demon of some sort. And, one of the things that binds the various story worlds of Kim Deitch together is the figure of Waldo in one form or another. I mean, he's going to appear in the vast majority of Deitch's work.
Right.
Either directly or tangentially in some form. In other words, there's got to be a cat somewhere in Kim Deitch comics.
And it's like you want it to show up, but it's also a nuisance. It's like you want it to show up, but it's also spooky.
Oh, yeah.
And
Waldo is spooky.
Waldo is very spooky.
He's scary, yeah.
But you want him to show up.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah.
But so anyway.
So I think it's interesting that that's another creator that you find yourself very much drawn to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think he's, I had mentioned Tomine as being, in my opinion, just one of the straight up best short storytellers in comics that I can think of. Kim Deitch is just straight up one of the best storytellers. Mm-hmm. And again, it's just in every, I know a lot of people like associate this kind of thing with Crumb, but I associate it with Deitch. It's like every line is an exorcism. It's like everything he draws. And from what I understand, I've only heard stories, but I understand he's a very disciplined person. But it's like there's an energy, not only in the storytelling, but in the the bizarre line work and that the meticulousness of what he does. It feels like an exorcism.
Yeah, and that's another creator that I wish we would see more from on a regular basis. Whether it be individual issues of comic books, which I don't think he really does anymore, or pieces in anthology, which, he had that really good piece in the latest Kramer's Ergo, so that's something. But I just really love Kim's work, and I would like to see more of it. But
I know what you mean. I do know what you mean by wanting to see more. But then there's another side of me that like feels like when he's ready, he'll let us see it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get a little tired of when you just see too much of somebody or something. I particularly get a little bit tired when somebody's becoming a kind of like, I don't know, almost like, I don't know if celebrity's the right word, but like a personality. And it's more about that than it is about the work. It's a fine line, but what do they say? What did Lincoln say? Better to keep your mouth shut and let people think you're stupid than open it and prove that you are. I don't know. On some level, I feel like it's not. We're not manufacturing. This isn't manufacturing suits. It's not mass production. It's. I think all these people, most of the people we've talked about, I don't think any of them are doing this strictly for the money. I could be wrong, but when the time is right, they'll put out the work.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of frequency,
who are you reading these days?
Oh, who am I reading? Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm
even
reading,
if it's not comics, are you reading? What are you reading these days?
Well, a lot of the comics I read, those are primarily dictated by my work with the podcast, by and large. Although I have found myself, both for the podcast and outside of the podcast, reading much more manga over the past 2 or 3 years than I had before. And so I'm reading more manga. And you were asking me what reading outside of comics that I'm doing. It's really interesting. I was telling a friend just the other day that I used to read primarily fiction, prose fiction.
Yeah.
But, over the past 10 years, I've read less and less of prose fiction, read more comics, and if I read something that's not comics, it's more times than not going to be either historical overviews of particular periods, usually in American history, because that fascinates me, or biographies. And I've unfortunately, not because I don't enjoy it anymore, but it's just a matter of time, I just have read less fiction, story collections, novels. And I think part of that, I used to do a lot of work on Philip Roth, and in 2010,
Really?
I guess for all, I did my dissertation on him.
You did, man.
Yeah, well, I founded the Philip Roth Society, and I was the founding editor of the Philip Roth Journal, Philip Roth Studies, and so I committed.
Portnoy's Complaint is like one of my favorite books.
Oh yeah, it's still a wild novel, and it's, I think, one of the best examples of Roth as people used to see him as a bad boy of American literature. I think he got even worse with a novel like Sabbath Theater, which if people were I don't know if you've read that.
I haven't read that.
But if people are offended by Portnoy's Complaint, they've seen nothing if they haven't read Sabbath Theater. Yeah, Sabbath Theater, which I think a lot of others consider his masterpiece, or one of the contenders for Roth's masterpiece.
Oh, I'll go pick it up.
Oh, yeah. It definitely is a book where he lets loose in ways that are much more dramatic than Portnoy's Complaint.
Wow. But is it as funny, though?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Portnoy's not as Complaint is so hilarious.
Not as outrageously funny. I mean, there are funny parts to it, but it's not the almost slapstick side that you find in Portnoy, because Portnoy was called instead of a stand-up comedy, sit-down comedy, And in fact, that's what critics like Irving Howe took him to task for. I mean, Irving Howe wrote a famous essay, and the title of it escapes me right now, where he basically said that he was one of Roth's biggest champions early in his career, with the first book, Goodbye Columbus, and 5 short stories. But then with Portnoy's Complaint, he felt that Roth had basically wasted his talent in trying to be the novelistic equivalent of a comedian, and he didn't even think that he did that too well. Of course,
he didn't think he did it well.
No, but of course it didn't hurt that Roth was also being very critical and comically so against the Jewish community, which, even though Howe himself could be critical of the Jewish community, I don't think it's the appropriate word, but he revered it more than I think Roth appeared to in Portnoy's Complaint.
Okay.
So yeah, he felt a little let down. And there was, in the 1970s and into the 80s, kind of a little back and forth between Roth and Howe, where Roth in... the third of the original Zuckerman trilogy, The Anatomy Lesson, created a fictional figure that, for all practical purposes, was Irving Howe, and he basically lambasted Howe in that caricature. And it was after that I think that I even read Howe's letter to Roth. He admits that Roth had the last laugh, and he said, "Let's put our differences aside."
Okay.
But I mentioned that because when Roth more or less retired from being a novelist or being a fiction writer in 2010 with the publication of Nemesis, that was around the time that I kind of tapered back on my reading of prose fiction and started to read more and more comics. And just of course, this is also right before the time that I started the podcast, Comics Alternative, where I basically have to read now all this stuff for the various review episodes, interviews, and whatnot that we do.
Right.
But, we were talking about frequency in comics earlier, and I wanted to ask you, now we're getting this first issue of the second volume of Happy Hour in America, and you said that Fantagraphics has more or less signed off on 6 issues of this. How often will this new volume of Happy Hour in America be coming out?
Well, okay, so this is kind of interesting because, I hope this isn't talking out of school, but I don't think it is. Eric Reynolds loves comics. Mm-hmm. He loves the comic book, and so I emailed Eric and Gary when a while back, just to ask them, questions about, what, how far to go with the comic book and what to do with the comic book, and how do you make a comic book successful? Essentially, is what I was asking, because I was rereading the 50 Cent Plague, and it was just it was interesting because it was the first time that I started thinking about, and again, this kind of it references back to Will Eisner. I was pretty impressed by both his artistic but his business acumen as well. So I was kind of like, well, you know what? It's kind of interesting. What are we, that's one thing I haven't given a lot of thought to, is the whole business aspect of this stuff. And so I was asking him questions, and so Eric and I had this back and forth that was very, kind of nuts and bolts, how you go about it, what you do, it's blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden got an email from Gary, which was just totally pulling the reins back and saying, "Whoa, Tim, you owe us a book." Do not get, derailed by this comic book thing. Mm. And so I'm thinking once or twice a year.
Okay. So we can expect to see the second issue of Happy Hour in America maybe by late spring, summer of next year.
Probably, yeah. I mean, I don't mean to make it sound like I'm some kind of like slave to Gary, but it really, I absolutely. Here's the thing. Working with Fantagraphics is one of the most extraordinary experiences. I don't know if you know this about Gary or not, but he's an archer, and bow and arrow, and he has a target where there's an arrow in the center of the target, and then another arrow that's splitting the last arrow. So you following what I'm saying?
Right.
That is as good a metaphor as I can think of to describe him as an editor. He's just right on with his advice. And so if I trust him, implicitly. And so if he's when he advises me in a direction, and this is what I think why someone like me needs an editor, because I'll be all over the place. I want to do graphic feature stories. I want to do the river, the spooky river story. I got a bunch of stuff I want to try to do. But what Gary does is he just keeps you on target, and he's really good at just just getting your head out of the clutter. I think of myself as more like a shotgun. I take a shotgun and shoot it at the target, and nothing hits the center. It all goes all over the place. I need people like Gary to help me, keep right center on the target.
Right. To split arrows with other arrows. That he is really good at giving advice and, precise advice like that. So will you be using this second volume of Happy Hour in America as, I guess, not a testing ground, but I guess our first glimpses into what will eventually become sections of the McQueen biography?
Yeah, sure. There'll be parts of the McQueen book. I am not going to publish the entire book in Happy Hour. Essentially, the Steve McQueen book is a selection of short stories and episodic pieces that can be read freestanding. The idea is that they are, in the best attempt that I can make, an enjoyable, entertaining, hopefully meaningful story, just freestanding. But when they are seen in a chronology, will have even a greater reverberating impact. So, you could read any of the stories and hopefully be entertained or be interested or, find something, feel that the time you spent reading it was worthwhile. But it won't have the same impact as the entire book seen chronologically. So, to answer your question, one, I'm not going to publish them in sequence, and two, I'm not going to publish all of them. In fact, I plan to finish the book within the next couple of years, so there won't even be enough issues of Happy Hour to cover all of that.
Well, from the way you describe it, it sounds like your plans for the finished Steve McQueen biography is, I guess, something somewhat akin to a short story cycle, as opposed to a short story collection. And, with a short story cycle, you have individual stories that by themselves, each of them could stand on their own, but within the context of the others in the collection, they resonate more deeply.
Absolutely.
Because of the context surrounding it. So it could be individual stories, like, for instance, in, Hemingway's In Our Time, right? I mean, each of those stories,
perfect.
Another one of your heroes, I know, each one of those stories in Our Time could stand on its own, and they have, in the anthologies.
Right.
But they all have this kind of binding element of Nick Adams.
Yes.
And so it's the Nick Adams that kind of gives it some coherency. Or let's say Gene Toomer in his book. Oh God! And the title is escaping me, and I'm kicking myself because I used to teach
Gene Toomer.
Yeah, Gene Toomer, another kind of early to mid 20th century writer. Part of the Harlem Renaissance.
Short story writer.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean,
okay. So your turn. So spells like tumor, just T-U-M-O-R?
Cain. Yeah, that's the name of the work. Gene Toomer, Jeantoomer. And yeah, he published a work in, I can't remember exactly when, 1920s, maybe early 30s, called Cain. And
C-A-I-N-E?
C-A-N-E.
C-A-N-E, like
right.
citizen. I guess citizen. Yeah. Citizens with a K, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, okay.
But yeah, and so basically what you find in Cain is a collection of stories and even poetry that each by itself stands on its own, but when you take everything together, the book Cain is just as much novelistic as it is a collection of individual pieces of, let's say, stories and poetry. Same thing could be said of In Our Time. And
but so this Gene Toomer, why haven't I heard of him?
Yeah, I think he's one of those writers, American writers and also Harlem Renaissance writers, that flies under the radar of many readers. I think that you do get him, at least historically I have, in terms of college courses. But outside of the college classroom, I have to tell you, I really haven't seen that many references to Toomer. And I think he's one of those participants of the Harlem Renaissance, or someone associated with the Harlem Renaissance, who is many times left out, not necessarily intentionally marginalized, but is not in the same league usually seen as others.
Right, like Langston Hughes or something like that.
Definitely like Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston even. But,
right.
Yeah, his work is something that you should definitely check out. But
absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, but the reason why I'm associating the short story cycle with Steve McQueen is that I think historically in American literature and even in comics, the story cycle, and in comics I call it the graphic cycle, has been used to encompass kind of a larger sense of, you can call it the American spirit, or a way of defining Americanness in one form or another. And there are just innumerable examples of the short story cycle in American literature. And we see it a lot in comics as well. I mean, think of, the book that is mistakenly considered the first graphic novel is Will Eisner's
stories.
Right. It's a collection of 4 stories. And it's not just 4 separate short stories. It's a graphic cycle, because each one of Eisner's stories in A Contract with God takes place on Dropsy Avenue. It's the same location. That is the binding material that brings all of these stories together. And along with that, Eisner also uses images and icons in particular ways that kind of tie everything together of those 4 stories. And he also structures those 4 stories in such a way that it makes sense to read it in that order, because if you kind of mix up the stories, then it doesn't have the same coherency as it would if you had, let's say, Kukeline, which is the last story, as the second one, and then A Contract with God maybe as the last one. It just has a completely different effect. And so, I don't know. I find a lot of value, and I get really excited with story cycles and graphic cycles. And so to hear you describe your Steve McQueen biography in ways that are somewhat similar, I guess, to the story cycle, gets me excited.
Well, I think the reason why, I actually have a big question for you. For me, there is something about a story cycle. If you think of like the mortar between the bricks, there's and somehow there's also a parallel between the idea of space and time that happens between panels in a comic story. Where the imagination takes over, where the the person viewing it or reading it assembles their own ideas, brings in their own perspective of things. Mm-hmm. That's what a story cycle does. It allows for, that mortar between the bricks. It's not giving you a flat wall. It's giving you bricks and then that space in between the bricks to kind of fill in and develop. So I think it's a way of inviting the viewer into the story and to be a part of that dialogue. Mm-hmm. In a way, and I won't say this of all things, but in a way that I think like a straight chapter by chapter story may not do. At least for me, anyway. I think that's part of what attracts me to the short story and story cycles, which is what Abandoned Cars and The Lonesome Go are. They're not a beginning and an end. They're a story cycle that's a group of short stories that are bound together by a theme, mm-hmm. and that theme is the mortar between the bricks.
Right.
I got a big question for you.
Okay.
So say you were teaching a class on the American graphic novel, and you wanted to have a diversity of voices, but you had to keep it to a very limited number, let's say one ethnicity per book. Would you choose A Contract with God or Mouse for the Jewish American experience?
Oh, Contract with God, no question.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's so helpful. Why?
Well, because I think that Eisner in A Contract with God, and I think Eisner in a lot of his graphic novels, in other words, the things that he started to create in the 1970s up to his death, not only dealt with issues of Jewishness, but a Jewishness that is anchored in the American experience. With Spiegelman's Mouse, I mean, yeah, to a large degree, the context is anchored in the American experience in terms of Jewish history, but the vast majority of Mouse goes beyond that, right? So it talks about the Jewish experience in a broader, more global sense, because the Holocaust is something that is not limited to just what was going on in Central Europe, during the 1930s into the 1940s. Right. And it affected more than just Western cultures and Jews in those Western nations. But I think with Will Eisner, he did in much of his work, Contract with God, but I would say a better example of the American Jewish experience in Eisner work is To the Heart of the Storm. I think that it's very autobiographical in that sense, but it also is kind of a sweeping work in that it talks about not just the life of Will Eisner and how he became who he is, but it also talks about the American experience or the Jewish American experience. And it includes also quite a bit of traveling, right? Because what happens in that graphic novel is that a young Will Eisner is on a train getting ready to go into the military and be shipped overseas. And as he's on that train, which in many ways is kind of like being on the road or being on the Mississippi River, is he is going back over his life and he's trying to make sense of things from his past and the perspective of where he is now. But those aren't.
But wait a minute. Keep in mind that so if this is a survey class, though, you're dealing with two majorly important books. One, which is, like you say, incorrectly considered the first graphic novel, but it is, I don't know. I mean, an argument could be made. And incidentally, why do you think that? I have a reason why I think it's incorrectly considered the first graphic novel, and I think it rhymes with lust. Is that Would you agree with that, or is there?
Oh,
do you have
yeah.
a different explanation?
No, I think that there are other things that we would call graphic novels that weren't called graphic novels then, but there are also instances of works where the creator did call them in one form or another, either a graphic novel or something very much akin to a graphic novel. It's
Right.
just that Eisner may not have been, who knows, aware of those instances, and so he thought that he was coining a relatively new phrase.
Okay.
And that's to be kind of generous to him.
So an argument could still be made that he is on some level at least the grandfather of the contemporary graphic novel.
Right. He was the most
stories,
vocal
they're very,
proponent.
very
He was its
personal
cheerleader.
stories.
Right.
They're I don't even think he had a publisher for him at first.
No, he had a hard time finding a publisher, and I think the first edition of Contract with God was Baron, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I would definitely choose Contract with God for this.
Okay, but so you have that.
Over.
You have but I don't mean to interrupt you, but so you have that, and then you've got a Pulitzer Prize winning, the only Pulitzer Prize winning.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't teach Mouse. And
really?
Yeah.
That's a great. So give me that insight.
Okay, because Mouse is one of those graphic novels or comics text, whatever you choose to call it, that tends to suck all of the air out of the room, right? And so I think
well said.
But it is so popular, it has won a Pulitzer. And for that reason alone, people are probably going to be familiar with that over other types of comics or graphic novels, right? So if someone has limited exposure to comics or graphic novels, but they've read one, let's say, chances are that one is going to be Mouse just because it's in the air. It's in the various college and even high school courses that they taught.
Right.
Or that they took.
Right. That may not have anything to do with the graphic novel.
Exactly. So for that reason alone, I would choose not to teach Mouse because it's something that if my students hadn't been exposed to previously, they probably will sometime in their college career.
Right.
Whereas Contract with God, as popular as it is, I think it gets much less attention than, let's say, a text like Mouse. I'd also use a Contract with God over Mouse. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'd also use Contract with God over Mouse because with Contract with God, it allows me to do so many other things outside of, let's say, the Jewish American experience. So, for instance, I could talk about the history of the graphic novel. I could also talk about, individual short stories or the story cycle. I don't know. I think that I think that it allows me to do more than Mouse would in certain classes. And so that, along with the sheer popularity and you could even argue the saturation of Mouse in our culture, I would choose Eisner over Spiegelman.
I'm sold. Mm-hmm. That was awesome. That was awesome. Yeah, okay. I've been struggling with that because Eisner was a very, very important early influence. And this idea of these two heavyweight contenders, you've got, Eisner, who, Contract with God, supposed to be the first graphic, contemporary, the grandfather of contemporary graphic novels. But then you got Mouse, which is the only Pulitzer Prize winning one, probably the more popular, more well-known one. I'm just so pleased to hear you say that.
Yeah. I mean, as much as I like Mouse,
what was the second Eisner choice you would have?
To the Heart of the Storm.
To Heart of the Storm. Maybe that's the one that would be better to go with.
Yeah. Because
part of this, I think part of educating is essentially just being a resource center, right? I mean, you're just you're on some level you're a reference, and I mean this in the best possible way. Mm-hmm. But you're like a reference booth. So start with that. Anybody who's interested in stuff that goes beyond that, then of course you include Contract with God, any number of his other graphic novels, plus Mouse. Mm-hmm. I love it.
So you're thinking about what to use on the syllabus next semester?
Yeah. I'm going to be teaching a survey class on the American graphic novel in the 20th century.
That's interesting.
So, but it's interesting because I'm dealing with it based on the diversity of voices.
Okay. When you first asked me that question, I wasn't sure what you meant by American graphic novel, because it could be, you could define it as a graphic novel written by an American, or a graphic novel that deals with the idea of America as a major theme in one form or another, which is probably written by an American as well. So,
no, it's specifically Americans who have written graphic novels from a diversity of voices. So, obviously Adrian Tomine is somebody I'm going to use, the brothers Hernandez, that's, and so and then, another big struggle for me was choosing between like Chris Ware and Daniel Clowes, because, by far Daniel Clowes has been the bigger influence on me, but you have a really hard time getting around Jimmy Corrigan, I think.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I would be more apt to use, and I have in the past, Jimmy Corrigan over, let's say, something like Ghost World, although I've used Ghost World as well.
Right.
But
see, to me, it's like a velvet glove. I love that book. I know it's, it has its dissenters, but you know what I'm saying? It's like if you're going to go for the Caucasian American, it's like, okay, so you got a lot, right? There are some tough ones, like Charles Burns. You got Chris Ware. You've got Daniel Clowes. Any three of those. You
also have Tim Lane.
Yeah, right. No, well, here's the thing: is that it's the 20th century, so I'm sticking to. That's why it's got to be really, you got to really compact everything, so that because once you get past 2000, the graphic novel world just goes crazy.
Right. Yeah.
I am including Diary of a Teenage Girl, which came out I think in 2004. But the events that took place in the 20th century, and I just love that book. But that's the only one that goes beyond 2000.
Okay.
But you know what I'm saying? It's just like you've got to keep. You've been in this kind of situation where you got to be mindful of the amount of time a semester takes, the amount of money that students can pay for the books themselves.
Right.
Some of these books, are going to take 2 weeks to go over, maybe more. But so Mouse and Contracted with God have been really weighing heavily on my mind which one to go with.
Yeah.
And I actually feel fairly liberated by what you're saying.
Another thing that would be interesting to throw in there is, if not for this next semester, then maybe for a future semester, is Karasik and Mazzucchelli's City of Glass.
Oh, but that's an adaptation.
Well, that's true, but, does that make it any less of a comic?
I don't know. It's a good question. It's just that, Paul Auster's I'd love to talk to you more about that, because that is one of the major books that when it's interesting, because when I found that book, and as soon as I read it, and it blew my mind. That one and Like a Velvet Glove were the two books that made me think that my direction should be in comics. And I contacted Bob Callahan, who at that time was one of the guys behind Neon Lit who were producing those books. And I was just like, is there anything I could do for you guys? Sent them my work and stuff. And I actually moved out to California to work with them, to work with them and stuff. But so, I have a huge respect for City of Glass, but it is an adaptation.
Right.
And if you've got an argument for why why that could be a centerpiece for a book. Actually, what I'd be more interested in is what book would you choose by either of the Hernandez brothers? I've chosen Heartbreak Soup.
Yeah. You know, if I were going to choose, okay, because when you're talking about the Hernandez brothers, you know, it's like, do you have enough time and space, and do the students have enough money to include both a Jaime and a Gilbert text? And if you're going to choose one, I don't know. In the past, I have taught with Gilbert. Oh God! Well, I've taught Poison River, which I don't know if it worked out that well because it confused my students more than anything. But human diastrophism is what I tend to gravitate toward because that worked well, not only serially, but also as a coherent, single, longer narrative or graphic novel. I mean, I like that. With Jaime's works, I don't know. I think that the Maggie and Hopi stories are a little more sprawling in some ways and a little harder to contain as coherent, again, if you want to call them this, graphic novels, which I think are to, you know, the story's strengths. But yeah, human diastrophism is what I would use. Although, if you have students who are a little squeamish when it comes to issues of sex, then that may be a problematic text. But then again, I mean, we're talking about Gilbert.
Well, they're going to be reading Diary of a Teenage Girl.
Okay. So, but I tell you what, you know, let me make another case for City of Glass. One of the reasons why I would consider using it is because it is an adaptation, and comics and adaptation, I think, is a very
long
fruitful.
There.
Yeah, and not only of works that are non-comics being adapted into comics format, but also, especially in the contemporary culture, comics that are being adapted to other mediums, whether they be television shows, films, or what have you.
Yes,
and so that gives you
thinking.
that gives you an opportunity to talk about another facet of comics and comics culture, the whole adaptation angle.
Right. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Maybe we should joint teach a class.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm curious. What do you think? So, like, I decided to not include Watchmen. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that choice?
Are you including any any of the superhero genre?
No.
Okay.
I've got to be really careful with the number of books and the price.
Yeah. See, in times when I have taught, let's say, general intro to comics kind of overview sort of classes, I've used either Watchmen or Marvel Civil War, or sometimes both, just because that gives students a taste of the superhero genre, but also critical twists and even commentary on the genre itself.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's why it's painful to have to cut that out.
Yeah. Well, anytime you're dealing with a syllabus for any kind of class, it's painful to make cuts.
I know, and yeah, I totally agree. That's we need to talk more about this. I really that's extremely helpful to me.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to. Maybe off mic we can carry on the conversation about comics and syllabi, and possible thematic topics for future comics courses. Because
absolutely,
I get excited over things like that.
The one thing, with Watchmen, even though it is a genre breaker and it's an important one. This class, I'm tailoring specifically to diversity of voices. Mm-hmm. So by that I mean, independent voices, more alternative voices, and I just don't know if I think throwing in the comic genre would fit better under a different type of curriculum theme. Yeah,
I see where you're coming from. And what I've done in the past is I've even used Kyle Baker's Captain America in comics courses, right? Because what that does is it allows me not only to talk about the superhero genre, but also an alternative voice within the superhero genre. Because with Baker's Captain America, he's dealing with issues of race. And so his Captain America is black. And he also situates it historically in terms of what was going on in the United States during the Second World War and the use of African Americans in the military, but also in terms of other things that were going on, such as scientific experimentation. And so I think it not only allows you to discuss the superhero genre, but also interesting alternate voices and visions within that genre.
You're making me feel so incapable of teaching a class like this. That is awesome. So, okay, Captain America.
Mm-hmm. Baker's Captain America.
Matt Baker?
Kyle Baker.
Okay, I was going to say that Matt Baker would have been way too late. Incidentally, Matt Baker, I'm a big fan of his drawing style, but I only know his work through It Rhymes with Lust. Do you know of anybody who's compiled work, just the work of Matt Baker? You know how like Fantagraphics has done all of the EC artists?
Mm-hmm.
And there's all kinds of Steve Ditko stuff out there and Charles Biro. And has anybody compiled the work of Matt Baker?
It's interesting that you say that because just recently for the podcast, I interviewed Mitch Maglio, who basically pulled together a recent book from Yo Books in IDW called Fiction House, From Pulps to Panels. And Matt Baker did a lot of the artwork. Thank God
for those guys.
Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that they are reproducing so much of that. Otherwise, very difficult to find stuff. But so it's through Yo Books and IDW?
This new book that just recently came out called Fiction House, From Panels, or From Pulp to Panels, from Jungle to, and I can't remember the other part of the subtitle. But Matt Maglio pulled that together, and he does discuss Matt Baker quite a bit in that collection because Baker did a lot of the illustrations for Fiction House. But there's a book that I think Tomorrow's came out with, on Matt Baker and his work called Matt Baker in the Art of Glamour, I think.
Okay.
I think that's a Tomorrow's book. Maybe I'm wrong there, but you may want to check that out as well.
Okay.
Well, Tim, I know that you and I could probably go on and on all night talking about various comics to use on a comics study syllabi. And, we'll resist the temptation because I tell you, this has been one hell of a substantive interview. We did it 2 years ago with the email-based interview. Now we're doing it again with the audio interview. So this new comic of yours, the second volume of Happy Hour in America, the first issue comes out on Wednesday, November 29th from Fantagraphics. Right. And we can, in this and subsequent issues, see what you're working on in terms of the Steve McQueen biography.
The Steve McQueen biography and any other kind of stuff that I just want to produce.
Yeah. If our listeners have not seen your earlier collections, Abandoned Cars and then The Lonesome Go, they should definitely check it out. But definitely get this first issue of the second volume of Happy Hour in America, which comes out on Wednesday.
Yeah, I think it's only going to be like $3.95, so very inexpensive for you folks.
Definitely affordable.
I tried to talk him into 10 cents, but that just wasn't going to happen.
No, I don't think Gary would have gone for that.
He wasn't going to go for that.
Yeah.
Although I won't go there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, thanks for coming on the podcast, and I hope to talk
Derek,
with you again with the biography when it comes out in a few years.
Absolutely. I hope to talk to you soon, just one-on-one, sometime in the future here.
Okay, I look forward to that.
Okay.
Boy, what a conversation that was. If you're still listening to this 2+ hours after we started the interview, I congratulate you and I thank you for sticking around. I also want to thank Tim Lane for getting in touch with me and agreeing to do this audio interview for the podcast. And I do want to keep in touch with Tim and talk about comics, teaching comics, and any variety of subject matters. As you can tell from this interview, Tim is a great guy to talk with, and there will be no end of topics for us to discuss. So if you enjoyed this interview and want to find out more about the work of Tim Lane, there are a couple of things you can do. One is to visit his Patreon page. That's www.patreon.com/Tim Lane. That's one word, Timlane, and support him through Patreon. You can also check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go there now and do a search for Tim Lane, you'll find that you can get 2 of his books, Abandoned Cars and The Lonesome Go, at 35% off of the cover price. You really can't beat those prices. So again, that's dcbservice.com. You can get his first 2 books there, and also definitely support him on Patreon. Patreon.com/Tim Lane. And after you do go to those sites, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Tim. You can go to our website, comicsalternative.com, and leave us a message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call me the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. You can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and Slack. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com. Thank you for listening to this interview. I had a great conversation with Tim Lane, and I hope you enjoyed it too. We'll be back soon with more episodes and more interviews. In the meantime, take care, and thanks for listening.
Here is a tale about a traveling kind. Been riding the rail, he looks to find. Train whistle well, roads left behind. From a Mexican jail to a saltwater mine. From a northern divide, the blood moon had shone. A mysterious guide through lands unknown. Deep skies spread wide.